coverage in preschool children. Thus, adequate vaccination prevents thousands of measles hospitalizations every year in the United States. However, the benefits spill over globally, as the United States' commitment to public health does not end at our borders. According to the CDC, quote, from 2000 to 2019, CDC supported worldwide vaccination efforts against measles that helped save over 25.5 million lives. In a joint report, UNICEF, the World Health Organization, and the Centers for Disease Control report that between 2000 and 2015, global efforts to fight measles caused deaths from measles to decline by 79%. My second contention is flattening the curve on COVID-19. Chris Delardi wrote in 2020 for The Nation that preventing healthcare systems from becoming overwhelmed during an epidemic requires flattening the curve, or in other words, slowing the rate of infection so that there are never too many cases requiring hospitalization. Siobhan Roberts writes in 2020 for The New York Times that mitigating the spread is crucial as it gives hospitals time to prepare, and writes that letting COVID-19 rip through our communities unmitigated will result in, quote, unnecessary suffering and death. Our efforts early in the pandemic to flatten the curve were effective at preventing suffering and death. Ajoka and Dinkar this year in PLOS, one, write that mask mandates increase mask wearing by 23.4%, decrease cases by 14%, and decrease deaths by 13%. This is why Liu and Webby at the University of Iowa in 2020 write that mask mandates early in the pandemic prevented over 200,000 cases of COVID-19. Additionally, Dezekas in 2020 for MIT writes that had the United States mandated a mask for employees of public-facing businesses on April 1st, the death count on June 1st would have been 40% lower. Unfortunately, as the United States has transitioned from prioritizing public health to prioritizing individual rights, Braden Waddle on July 30th of this year reports that cases are spiking across the country as the highly contagious Delta variant spreads. The Associated Press on August 19th wrote that hospitals were desperately shipping COVID-19 patients on ambulances, helicopters, and planes to other hospitals with room available, oftentimes across state lines. Unfortunately, space is not always available, which is why Hasseltine reports for Forbes on July 26th that 1 in every 4 deaths from COVID-19 are now attributable to hospital strain. Despite the violation of individual rights, flattening the curve would prevent 1 in every 4 deaths from COVID-19. I urge you to vote affirmative.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay, I'm gonna start my time now. Resolved, when in conflict, the United States' obligation to protect public health outweighs the preservation of individual freedom. We oppose this resolution. Our contention is structural violence. The role of the judge is to prioritize structural violence. Our weighing mechanism for the round is to shift the focus to the slower, less flashy impacts that affect marginalized communities over impacts of large numbers and spectacle. The commonly ignored impact is most dangerous. Jackson 12. Big threats distract you from structural violence. The state engages in security theater, hoping you won't notice economic inequality, suicide, domestic, and structural violence. It is more exciting than how people are discriminated against. Security is one confidence trick to distract you from inequalities, which are the real threat. You're much more likely to die from structural violence. Public health relies on deeming people threats to it. Government and institutions create threats that put public health at risk and undermine security. This targets our most vulnerable and feeds legitimacy to existing bigoted structures of power. Integrated threat theory proves. 7 et al. 2. Integrated threat theory brings perspectives to understand the role of threats and intergroup attitudes. Members of an in-group expect out-group members to behave in ways that are detrimental. Threats cause prejudice and hostility to the source. Threats refer to the physical or material well-being of the in-group, e.g. their health and welfare. We offer 2 examples of how protecting public health over preserving individual freedom has disastrous effects. 1, reproductive rights. Abortion is currently a public health crisis for pro-life advocates, and individual rights to bodily autonomy are being thrown out the window. Blackshaw and Roger, 21. It is believed that governments are obliged to protect public health. This is at times in tension with individual rights. Pro-life advocates argue for the immorality of abortion. If fetuses are persons and a society values public health, then fetuses must be protected. Abortion constitutes a significant public health crisis. Public health ethical principles justify overriding bodily autonomy to prevent harm to fetuses. Denying reproductive rights directly increases gender violence via agency loss for pregnant people. Muratori 21. Reproductive rights and gender violence are linked by the loss of agency and bargaining power experienced by pregnant people. Access to abortion has a sizable effect on violence against pregnant people and intimate partner violence. The impact is gender violence, which is institutional and brutalizing. Feminist intervention is key. NIAC 6. We define gender violence as systematic institutionalized violence that operates through the constructs of gender and at the intersection of sexuality, race, and nationality national identity. Gender violence targets marginalized groups and any other perceived threats. Gender violence and hegemonic projects can help each other. We are pushing for feminist intervention. We must interrogate gender violence as constitutive of power and political violence. 2, medical homophobia. Historically, gay and bisexual men have faced homophobic barriers to freely donating blood, including lifetime bans and sex referral requirements to protect the general public health from an AIDS epidemic, HRC, no date. The FDA moved from a lifetime ban on gay and bisexual men to donating blood to a deferral of 1 year. AIDS acts as a public health crisis that requires the FDA to make decisions that maintain blood safety, and individual freedoms for queer folk are put on the back burner in the name of protecting public health. The MSM-specific barrier is rooted in structural homophobia. The otherization is linked to depression, anxiety, and suicide. Zane 21. MSM are not allowed to give blood. Allowing MSM equal access to donate wouldn't be putting anyone at additional risk of HIV. The MSM-specific barrier is unnecessary and rooted in homophobia. Activists encourage the FDA to move its restrictions. The ban perpetuates stigma. Time deferrals are based in discrimination, but the FDA is pursuing strategies that maintain so-called blood safety. The ban creates others out of those excluded. Categorical dehumanization can lead to negative mental health outcomes, including depression, anxiety, and suicidal tendencies. Structural factors cause harm to the gay community, both emotionally and physically. Removing the ban would alleviate that stigma. Framing HIV/AIDS as a security or public health results in an undemocratic rule in other areas. It doesn't end with blood donation. Protecting health paves the way for civil liberties to be overridden. ELB 6. Portraying AIDS as a national threat risks fueling dehumanizing responses and could serve legitimization of any emergency policies. Such moves justify paving the ways for civil liberties to be overridden. The impact is homophobia. Heteronormativity captures queer agency through near life, meaning that it inhibits queer people from being able to live their full lives through overkill and disenfranchisement. Stanley 11. Near life throws into crisis the category of life. The incomprehensible murders of Weaver apprehend the relationship between relentless structural violence and traumatic afterlives. This war is legal practices within the everyday. The structure of anti-queer violence renders specific bodies as nothing. In conclusion, prioritizing public health relies on deeming people threats to it, whether that be pregnant people or queer folk. This threat construction feeds legitimacy to structures of gendered violence and homophobia by directly greenlighting institutional bigotry, which creates the conditions for structural violence to become possible. Thank you.
All right, I believe it's 3 minutes for cross.
Yes.
All right. Whenever you're ready.
Okay. So your contention is about vaccines and saying that they are successful in flattening the curve. However, is it not important to recognize that many of these restrictions violate like the freedoms, and that when we violate those freedoms, we start to pave the way for other civil liberties that to be restricted as well?
Yeah, so we're talking specifically about like vaccine mandates and like the impact they have like on lives and like people being able to live. So what we're talking about specifically with these vaccine mandates is focusing specifically on vaccine mandates. We're not talking about like erosion of democracy as a whole. We're talking about like how these mandates are important tools in ensuring millions of people don't die. All right. So you talk about how treating like this sort of like gender violence point. Could you like explain like just how that links to public health?
Right. So in the beginning of our speech, we are providing you evidence that talks about how public health is like linked to this idea of a threat, right? So we see that governments and institutions operate by deeming things threats to public health. And we are saying that when we take that view of public health and prioritize that in this obligation, like with our institution of the government, that has disastrous effects in terms of reproductive rights. Because we've shown you in the literature that conservatives will use this kind of pro-life, public health rhetoric to defend pro-life stances, which therefore takes away reproductive rights and the individual freedom of pregnant people. And we're saying that directly links to gender violence via the loss of agency of pregnant people, as well as we think that there is an imperative to just uphold the rights of pregnant people and to have the right to choose with their bodies, right? And so we think that we need to prioritize structural violence and how we combat that, because structural violence, as we've given you in our first card, is the way in which most people are killed. And so we think that like in today's round, we must combat structural violence. And so when we look at this definition of public health and how governments generally use it by deeming people threats to it, as shown with integrated threat theory, then we see like the loss of rights, of reproductive rights. And that argument extends to this idea of medical homophobia as well, where when we deem gay people a threat to like these blood donations, then we see that as otherization, which leads to negative mental health outcomes, as well as like paving the way to take away civil liberties from those people.
Okay. There's like 7 seconds remaining, so yeah, I'm not gonna ask another question. We're gonna take just a little bit of prep time. All right. I'm gonna unmute so my partner can use the microphone.
Okay. Is anybody not ready?
We're good.
Okay. Time will start now. Start at the very top. They tell you that structural violence is the biggest impact in the round. We agree, but we're going to win the round anyways. We tell you in case that the United States prioritizing public health has resulted in saving 25.5 million lives. Most of these lives have been saved in the developing world. We would tell you that colonialism is the biggest example of structural violence and is the result. Colonialism is the biggest example of structural violence, and it structurally disadvantages people in developing countries. We are telling you that when the United States prioritizes public health over individual rights, it results in vaccines flowing to these other countries. That saves 25.5 million lives, and it also solves one of the biggest causes of death in developing countries, measles. What we tell you specifically is that since we started distributing these vaccines, death from measles has declined by 79%. Again, what we would tell you is that if you're going to vote on structural violence, you're going to vote on alleviating colonialism, because colonialism is the biggest example of structural violence because it has the massivest scope of all structural issues. That means that you're voting for us because we save 25.5 million lives in developing worlds. Then go to the first warrant about reproductive rights. We tell you that the public health community doesn't consider abortion an issue. Instead, the public health community is largely focused on increasing access to abortion because it's a health issue. That's exactly right. It's a really important issue. But the public health community, the people who actually implement the policies when we prioritize public health over individual rights, they believe that we should increase access to abortion. It literally doesn't matter what Republicans are out here saying about abortion rights, because when it comes down to it, the public health establishment isn't going to hinder abortion rights. Instead, they're going to expand access to abortion. That's really important because it means there's no reason to reject the resolution on face. You're preferring public health institutions here and what they say because they're the ones that actually execute public health policy. Then go to their medical homophobia point. The public health institution literally hates this. They're not going to expand on it when you implement public health policies that take preference over individual rights. Additionally, I would tell you that access to blood and blood banks are not actually a public health issue because they're not about health at large. They're about health in hospitals. So it's non-topical. It doesn't link to the topic. That means they gain no offense off of it. But then We'd also tell you that we're going to win around it another way through gun violence. Gun violence is a public health crisis. The American Public Health Association writes in 2021 that gun violence is a leading cause of premature death in the United States, as guns kill more than 38,000 people and cause nearly 85,000 injuries each year. Because of this, the APHA writes that a comprehensive public health approach to address this growing crisis is necessary. Beck, in February of 2020, writes that all people are not at the same risk for gun violence. Homicides continue to disproportionately affect young black men, and potential explanations include components of structural violence such as racial segregation and income inequality. So when it comes down to structural violence, the only possible vote is an affirmative one. First, because of colonialism. Colonialism is the biggest structural impact in the round. It leads to millions upon millions of people dying every year, and if we gain offense against colonialism, what we're doing is we're winning the round because we are solving the biggest structural impact in the round. Again, we saved 25.5 million. We have saved 25.5 million lives in developing worlds by prioritizing public health over individual objections. That's really important. But then the second reason that you're voting for us is, again, on gun violence. Gun violence is a structural violence issue because it disproportionately affects young black men. That means that if we gain offense against gun violence, because gun violence is a public health issue, and if you take a public health approach, you lower gun violence, that means that we gain offense against structural violence. That's really important because it means we're the only team in the round that can actually do something about it, and we're the only team in the round that actually has done something about it by prioritizing public health.
Okay. All right, I just want to make sure everyone can hear me. Yeah?
Yes.
All right. We oppose the idea that the United States is obligated to protect public health over individual freedom. We give you two reasons right at the top for this. First is reproductive rights, and the second is medical homophobia. They have no evidence to counter any of our arguments. Rather, they just make analytics that, we're not close enough to the topic. I'll get to the crux of that. They agree with our role of the judge that you have to prioritize structural violence, but they say they're going to win on that. You're not going to let them do that because they are claiming global impacts. Check the actor of the resolution. It's about the United States obligation. You do not get to claim offense off of people in the United States getting vaccinated when you say that your impacts are mostly in the developing world. You can't make these arguments about colonialism because the United States vaccination programs doesn't have anything to do with colonialism in the global south. Do not let them claim these giant impacts. Even if you do, they say they get all the way up to 25 million lives. Think about the people that are affected by our impacts. Think about the scope here. That is about half of the population of the United States. That is inclusive of pregnant people and or queer people. So we outweigh on magnitude and scope there. Now, onto the reproductive rights argument. They say that we shouldn't care what Republicans say. Think again, have you seen what's going on in Texas? Obviously, Republicans influence policy, right? And so these pro-life circles take abortion, they make it a public health crisis, and they say that we have to forego rights to bodily autonomy. They're getting rid with Roe v. Wade. This increases gender violence because of agency loss, and it increases domestic violence and gender violence. Onto medical homophobia. Their only argument is that blood is not a public health issue. They have no evidence to support this. We have evidence, our Zane card, that says the FDA has declared this a public health issue to maintain blood safety. That is their only other argument. But we know that this policy is rooted in homophobia and links to severe mental health issues for queer people. I'm going to move on to their case now. Now, I already made our scope argument, which means I don't have to answer anything else there, but we're going to get into the nitty-gritty. First, their argument about vaccines. Mandatory vaccination normalizes eugenic thought and state control over individual bodies. Weiner 15. We own our bodies. We decide informed consent. The government vaccine program fails to properly inform. Corruption is a way of life for the CDC. It has refused to compare the long-term health status of the fully vaccinated. Vaccine mandates undermine parental authority and demonstrate that the state owns our children. The vaccine program serves as forced collectivism. The Supreme Court's earlier decision upholding a vaccine mandate was the legal precedent for the court's support for forced sterilization. Eugenics. Now, I'm going to move on to the rest of their arguments about vaccine mandates. Now, mandates are not effective. Non-compliance is rampant. LA County Sheriff proves AP 21. The LA Sheriff says he will not enforce the county's vaccine mandate. Villanueva said his employees are willing to be terminated rather than get vaccinated. I don't want to be in a position to lose 10% of my workforce overnight on a vaccine mandate. Now, they make an argument about masks and COVID. Stats prove that it doesn't help. Where at 21. Case growth was not significantly different between mandate and non-mandate states. At lower high transmission rates, surges were equivocal. have answered everything for vaccines that they're claiming for measles. Again, they say that measles is global. You're not going to let them get global impacts because that's not fair. If everyone gets global impacts, then we get global impacts for homophobia and gender violence abroad, which means that we definitely outweigh their numbers. But keep it to the United States. I'm going to move on to their gun violence argument, the new one. They say that we should focus on how it disproportionately affects black people. We're going to turn this argument. Gun control targets black gun owners, further structural violence perpetrated against them. Tomato 19. These laws have systemically targeted outgroups at key point in the country's history, relegating black Americans to second-class status in favor of political and economic status quo. Data shows that more than 56% of federal firearm offenders were black. On-the-ground enforcement of tougher gun laws will mean more harassment at the hands of police, more arrests, and more harsh prison sentences. Gun control has historically been used to target black people and keep them from means of self-defense, Stepman 18. The argument actually reveals that it is gun control, not gun rights, that has generally been used for the purpose of white supremacy. Some of the first states to pass highly restrictive gun control legislation were, in fact, in the Reconstructionist era South. One 1866 Alabama law boldly stated that it should not be lawful for any person of color in the state to own firearms. Frederick Douglass warned about these abuses and said the work of abolitionists is not finished until the Second Amendment and others' rights could be protected. Ready for crossfire? You could go first.
I'm unmuted.
Okay, awesome. So you basically make what's the impact of gun control targeting black gun owners?
Well, we term it's structural violence, right? So black people can't defend themselves. It leads to more violence at the hands of police, more arrests, and more harsh prison sentences.
So
I can go into why.
This is a good guy with a gun argument, right?
What?
It's like the NRA says, the only thing that can stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Is that what you're telling me?
No, that is quite literally the opposite. We are defending black self-defense. So this is actually a lot more leftist than the argument you're making. The NRA's argument is for conservatives to have gun ownership because they need it for hunting and to stop the evil government. No. If you look at what black militant leftists want, or black people in general, they want their guns to protect themselves and their communities from the police.
I don't think either of us should be speaking about what black people want, but you can take a question.
What does that even mean? I read evidence about what. Okay, I can take a question. Yeah, why do you get to claim impacts for colonialism throughout the whole world when you're talking about measles vaccines in the United States?
When the United States prioritizes public health, they prioritize that public health beyond the United States. The resolution only says the United States as an actor. You're absolutely right, but it doesn't limit the impacts to the United States as a territory.
Well, let's dig into that. What does it mean for the United States to prioritize public health abroad?
It means for the United States to, I don't know how to make it simpler than that.
Okay, well, it sounds to me like that's colonialism, right? Medical colonialism in other countries and intervention, which is what you say is bad. But
have 25.5 million lives been saved or not?
Yeah, that sounds a lot like interventionalism to me. But you can ask a question.
Sure. Let's talk about medical homophobia. No, never mind. You can take another question.
I can take another question. Okay, so for gun violence, when you say it disproportionately affects black people, if black people want guns, why should they not be able to have them?
The public health approach shows that the biggest risk factor for causing a violent crime is owning a gun. So we reduce violent crime against black people by reducing ownership of guns.
But if black people want to have guns, why do you think it's okay to take it away from them?
That's a weird way to frame it. Our entire argument is we're approaching it from a public health perspective. Public health is risk factors and protective factors. The biggest risk factor for committing gun violence is owning a gun. The biggest protective factor against gun violence is taking away guns.
It sounds like you're telling people what's best for them without caring what they want to do in their lives.
It sounds like it would save lives.
Interesting argument to tie with colonialism. Okay, that's cross.
We're going to take prep. All right. 1 second. I'm resetting my timer. Give me a second. Sorry. All right. So the order of this is going to be colonialism, reproductive rights, and gun violence, and then the act case. All right. Is everyone ready?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so let's start about this point about colonialism. The thing that the app is doing in today's debate is saving lives previously disadvantaged by colonialism. That's what the app is doing in today's debate. Like we said in Cross-Ex, what the app is doing is we are prioritizing public health by expanding the reach of vaccines, which is helping people previously disadvantaged by colonialism. That's one of the most important things in today's debate is about saving lives and the impact that is going to have. The app is saving 25.5 million lives through the expansion of this vaccination program and helping people previously disadvantaged by colonialism. That's one of the most important reasons. That's one of the most important reasons why the app helps to solve structural violence. But then on that next point about reproductive rights, here's the thing: no one in Texas is talking about public health. Our opponents tell you to look at Texas. Here's the thing: none of the Republicans in the legislature are caring about public health. We tell you in rebuttal about the public health establishment, which is going to prioritize reproductive rights. That's what you pay attention to. Next, on this point about gun violence, here's the thing: decreasing gun ownership decreases gun violence. That's going to have the greatest effect on people who are victims of gun violence, specifically Black Americans who are victims of gun violence. That's one of the things that we've been talking about in today's debate. If we want to actually decrease violence against gun violence against Black people, what we need to do is decrease gun ownership. That's the root cause of gun violence. Now let's take a look at our case. We tell you about what the impacts of vaccination, how vaccination has saved 25.5 million lives, and how vaccination and vaccine mandates are one of the most important ways by prioritizing public health that you do this. If you look at our case, we tell you that these vaccines are one of the most important ways to actually solve the issues behind public health issues that we're seeing in the status quo. Next, we tell you about hospitalization and flattening the curve, which our opponents barely even respond to. We're telling you that it is incredibly important that we decrease strain on hospitals in order to treat disease effectively, in order to effectively save lives. That's what we need to prioritize. That's one of the things that's most important in today's debate, is saving lives. The AF helps save lives previously disadvantaged by colonialism. We help save lives by taking a public approach to gun violence and vaccinations. If we actually want to have significant effects on saving lives in today's debate, you have to go for the AF. Understand that not only does the AF save lives previously disadvantaged by colonialism, not only does the AF decrease gun violence, overall, the AF saves lives. Vote AF.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay, I'm gonna start my time now. First, up top, I would really like to address this idea of scope, right? My partner has shown you why we went on scope. They keep hammering in this number about 25.5 million lives that they could save. However, we outweigh this, right? We've shown you that in our case, if we do not oppose this resolution, then the structural violence that will affect pregnant people and queer folks is a much larger number than the 25.5 million people that they claim, right? And so we will see a direct increase in violence and potentially a decrease in the civil liberties of those people. Now, I would like to move on to some of the arguments that they've made. It really seems as if we started to debate about colonialism in this debate, and the AF wants you to believe that somehow going into other countries and vaccinating them is going to save them by colonialism. Well, I wonder what this sounds like, right? So we said, oh, we have to go into Iraq. They have weapons of mass destruction. We need to save them. And what happened? What happened? That is U.S. interventionist colonialism as an example. This idea that we can solve colonialism by vaccinating people is horribly misconstrued. Also, this idea that like we're going to go vaccinate people, there are indigenous people whose cultures do not want them to be vaccinated. So the idea that we will go into other countries, prioritize public health, and do what is best for them is inherently dangerous and colonialistic, and therefore further structural violence. So for that reason alone, you should vote them down. Secondly, they want to talk about gun control, right? However, we would first like to talk about this idea that there will be unequal enforcement of these gun control laws. My partner read you a card that talks about how there are harsher sentences equated with this idea of increasing gun control laws. And we've seen that historically proven that these gun control laws are unfairly used to target Black people, right? Then in CrossX, my partner asked them about how if somebody wants to have access to a gun and you are saying that like, no, we won't give you access to a gun, isn't that inherently paternalistic, right? It's this idea that, oh, we will save them. And this is really coming out of the app on all sides. And they're talking about how we will save people from colonialism, we will save people from themselves. This idea is exactly perpetuating the kind of structural violence that we are asking you to judge today's round on, because we gave you cards at the top of our case that tell you about why structural violence is the most important impact to consider and how it affects people the most. And so for those reasons, you should vote them down. Secondly, they go on to talk about our argument about reproductive rights. They say that nothing is going on in Texas, but we've shown you the literature of how public health crisis language is used in relation to reproductive rights. That's the key. We see conservatives using that language to justify taking away reproductive rights, which leads to an increase in gender violence. And to say that, oh, Republicans can say all they want, it doesn't affect policy, is horribly misleading. For example, who is the director of the CDC? The director of the CDC is a political appointment. Who chooses to appoint that? The party in power. So to make this assumption that, oh, Republicans can say whatever they want and it doesn't matter is just false. And we really need to evaluate that, right? Because we need to see how, when we take this definition of public health, when we take this definition of prioritizing it and say it's our obligation, the negative impacts that that leads on people in terms of structural violence. Thank you.
Ensure safety as an affirmation that's flawed, because they're talking about long-term existential
Alrighty,
threats.
nice round, folks. I dropped my email in the chat. There's a lot of evidence. Can y'all send me like if you have a constructed file or a constructed copy, you can either send it to my email, but I want to like read through some of the evidence when I'm going through my flow, so if you don't mind, that'd be great. There's also the file share here, but if you want to just email it to me, you can. Whatever works best for you. And then I will evaluate my flow sheets and I'll render my decision.
I think there's still a crossfire in keyboard speed test.
Oh shit! Yes.
I was about to say there's still Grand Cross and Final Focus.
Damn. Okay. My policy debater is showing. I'm so sorry. I'm so used to policy.
No worries.
Continue.
Okay. Okay, we're ready to start whenever y'all are.
All right.
Okay, so we want to start time now?
1 second.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Okay, so firstly, I would really like to ask you how this idea, you're saying that you're solving colonialism, but then you're saying that you know what is best for other people, and so you're going to go into these countries and prioritize public health. How is that in and of itself not interventionist and colonialistic?
It's a debate round. We're debating policy impacts. We're never going to claim to solve colonialism, just as the neg team can't claim to solve colonialism by reading an argument.
So we're not.
The thesis of our argument is that we are saving lives that were previously disadvantaged by colonialism. That provides offense against colonialism.
You would say that colonialism is no longer an issue.
What?
You said previously disadvantaged by colonialism. So are you saying that it's no longer?
Like they're disadvantaged now? I mean, that's just like a wording thing. You guys can take another question.
Okay, so my question comes to what's going on in the United States. Abortion restrictions are sweeping the country, specifically in Texas. and pregnant people are losing access to their reproductive rights. How can you say that nothing is going on and that what Republicans do doesn't matter?
Well, pretty easy. That's not what we say at all. What we say specifically is that not a single Republican is framing this as a public health issue, because Republicans are pretty over public health in general right now. Your entire argument is that like Republicans and other conservatives are using public health to justify violating like the right to abortion, but we're telling you that they're not doing that.
Actually incorrect, because we read a piece of evidence that says that pro-life advocates are using the term public health to protect,
Has a single one of them been elected?
Like, do you have any evidence that goes against this, if that's what your argument is? Because we're the only one that read it.
We're not making it, so it's not our burden. Has a single one of these pro-life advocates been elected?
What?
Has a single one of these pro-life advocates that is saying that like abortion is a public health issue, have any of them been elected?
That's what my partner was saying about how have you seen the abortion bans that are sweeping the country? That rhetoric is used in implementing those bans. It's
Okay.
Okay, you can ask the question.
Yeah, do you have a question, Caroline?
I mean, that kind of covered my question.
You guys can take another.
So do you not, so when you talk about increasing gun control in those gun laws, do you not agree that if we already have a system that unequally enforces these laws, that making them harsher will only make the sentences harsher and therefore even more disproportionately affect those communities that you are saying you're going to help?
I mean, I would rather they not die of gun violence.
Okay, but would you rather, so then you're going to have those people sit in prison for longer because you're going to break the gun control laws?
All right, we have a minute left to prep, and we're going to take that.
You unmuted?
Yeah.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Okay. The order will be AF, then neg. Is anybody not ready? Time will start now. On the AF, they drop literally all their case defense and summary. So at this point, we're linking in best to the structural violence weighing. Again, we concede the weighing, so whoever links best into structural violence is going to win the round. They drop literally all case defense, which means only we have a risk of offense. We have a pretty clean risk of offense, which is right away, you can vote for us. Go to the neg flow. Let's do some weighing again. We tell you specifically that when the United States prioritizes public health at home, it spills over abroad. That saves 25.5 million lives as the CDC gives out vaccines that are then administered in the developing world. That combats colonialism pretty cleanly because it combats the disadvantage that these people have that has been entrenched by colonialism. It saves lives of people that are disadvantaged by colonialism. That means that we're the only team that is offense against colonialism, and that's the biggest example of structural violence, which right away you could pretty easily vote for the
the affirmative. But let's get into the nitty-gritty. They talk about indigenous cultures, but there's always going to be religious exemptions, so there's no sort of impact for forcing indigenous cultures to take the vaccine. So at the end of the day, they read you no impact about how medical colonialism specifically is bad. They just say colonialism, and then they expect you to do the pen work for them, but they don't really read any impact as to why medical colonialism is bad. They just tell you it is. Don't let them get away with this. Again, we saved 25.5 million lives. That's really important because these people have been disadvantaged by colonialism, and we saved their lives. That's really important. We're the only team with the risk of offense against the weighing mechanism. Go to reproductive rights. They misunderstand our argument. Not a single Republican that's been elected frames abortion as a public health issue because they know they're going to get slammed in the media because they aren't prioritizing public health. They look entirely hypocritical. They aren't doing it right now. Just because some random pro-life activist is doing it doesn't mean that it's actually a phenomenon in the people who actually make the laws. Then on gun violence, they tell you it's paternalistic, but there's no impact of paternalism. Again, they're expecting you to do the flow work for them. They aren't reading any evidence here. But then this good guy with a gun, the good guy with a gun myth is BS, and everyone in the round knows it. At the end of the day, we're solving by lowering gun violence, which lowers structural violence.
All right, we're going to take all our prep. Okay, that's prep. Can y'all hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to start with our case and then go on to their case. Is everyone good? All right, I'll start. The United States should not protect public health over the notions of individual freedom. Throughout this round, we have demonstrated why this is true, particularly in the case of reproductive rights. I want to start off with some mechanism and framing at the top and why we take this round. In every single one of our speeches, they have neglected to answer our scope argument. Even if you grant them that they somehow solve colonialism with these vaccines and they keep giving you 25.5 million, think about the population of the U.S., right? We're sitting at over half when we talk about pregnant people and queer people, which means we're already in the range of 180 million. So just on that, we win alone. They haven't addressed it in any speeches, and it's been consistent throughout the debate. So default con just on that. But I'll get into the discussion of reproductive rights, right? Abortion is a public health crisis for Republicans. I'll get into the details why later. But what this means is that individual freedoms like bodily autonomy are foregone because we need to stay, on the pro-life side. That's the argument that politicians are making, and that is reflected in the policies that they're enacting. This leads to gender violence because it is a loss of agency for pregnant people, right? The act of not having reproductive rights and control over your own body is an act of violence that perpetuates a system, which means that feminist intervention is key. Their argument is that people don't actually say this in the media. This is ridiculous. Our Blackjaw and Roger evidence is fantastic. Think about what's happening in Texas. Think about how they're justifying these policies. Think about the language that surrounds the abortion debate, right? Pro-life, infanticide, protect the unborn. I'll go on to their case. So we straight-turned it. We didn't drop it. We're saying that this vaccine force is colonialism. Think about what happened in Iraq. Are they going to go and vaccinate indigenous people that don't want to get vaccinated? Historically, there was a CIA campaign in Pakistan where they pretended to vaccinate people with hepatitis B so that they could catch Osama bin Laden, and that backfired, and now they're all anti-vaxxers who refuse it. So this idea that we're going to go save the global south by forcing them to get vaccines is paternalistic and backfires, which means that they can access their impacts.